Professor Green, we welcome you to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats today. We're so happy to hear from you today on the checks and balances that the House and Senate have on each other. And we're excited to be launching our new podcast series on the resilience and relevancy of checks and balances in the U.S. Constitution. So I'm going to turn it over to you and for some opening comments, and then we'll go to questions.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm excited to talk about this topic of checks and balances within the legislative branch. Now, most people are familiar with the concept of checks and balances, and if you went on the street and asked the average person, what's American politics about? What's the Constitution about? Most people would say probably either separation of powers or checks and balances. But when people think about checks and balances, it's usually checks and balances between different branches of government. So the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. But there's another important set of checks within our constitutional system, and that's inside of Congress, between the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, that's partly just a facet of having a legislative branch that has two chambers, or what we call bicameralism. But it's also by design. So what I want to talk about a little bit in my opening remarks is first of all, why we have bicameralism and the extent to which it was done deliberately to create checks in the legislative branch to limit the power of the legislature. And then also, second, I want to talk a little bit about some of the features of the House and Senate that make it more likely for the two chambers to check each other. So first, in terms of why we have bicameralism, when checks and balances, when we think about checks and balances between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, we understand that to be an important feature that was put into our constitutional regime to limit the power of any one branch. But that's also, we have evidence that the founders were thinking about the same thing when they decided to create a bicameral legislature. So, for example, a gentleman named James Wilson, who was one of the delegates from Pennsylvania at the Constitutional Convention, warned the delegates of the, quote, danger of legislative despotism. And he further said, quote, you can only be restrained, the legislature can only be restrained by dividing it within itself. Now, if you look later at the writings in the Federalist Papers, which were written to help persuade states to adopt this new constitution, in Federalist Paper 51, James Madison wrote that, quote, in a Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And the remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches. So those are just two examples of founders who were saying, look, you have to create at least two chambers in the legislature to prevent the legislative branch from becoming too powerful. And I'd also note that one of the most important influences on the founders was the French philosopher Baron Montesquieu, who in the 1730s, when he was talking about the British legislature, which I'll talk about in a moment, noted that because it has two chambers, one chamber is checking the other. So again, you have that phrase checking. So the idea that we should have two chambers was very much a consequence of the concern that a legislative branch could be too powerful. So you need to have checks within the legislature. Now, I should note, though, that this is not the only reason we have a bicameral Congress. For one thing, the founders wanted to not just create a new system of government from scratch without any models that they could draw upon of successful governance. And bicameralism was shown to be a system that worked. You had, for starters, the British Parliament, which, starting in the 14th century, basically invented bicameralism. You had a House of Commons and a House of Lords. And although the founders were very upset with British policy, they recognized that the Parliament was a functioning legislature. In addition, 10 of the 13 states at the time of the drafting of the Constitution had bicameral legislatures. So there were these models that they could draw upon of successful legislatures that were bicameral. A second and related reason was that they didn't want to create a system that Americans were unfamiliar with. And Americans were familiar with bicameralism. They knew about the British Parliament. They knew about their state legislature. And in fact, another Virginia delegate named George Mason at the convention remarked that one of the things he thought Americans generally agreed upon was bicameralism, that a two-chamber legislature makes sense. So those are two reasons why bicameralism was adopted, and adopted pretty quickly. In fact, it's one of the first things that was adopted at the Constitutional Convention without dissent, except for, I think, Benjamin Franklin. They all agreed, and they passed a resolution saying, whatever our Congress is, it should have two chambers. We don't know how people will get elected or will they represent, but it'll be two chambers. And I also just finally note that having two chambers was very helpful at the convention when there was a conflict over whether or not members of the legislature should be elected proportionally, so larger population states get more members, or every state should have an equal number of members. You got two chambers, so each one could address each of those needs. One is the House, where larger states have more members. The other is the Senate, where every state has an equal number of members. Now, I just want to briefly, in the time I have left, just talk about a few things about Congress that I think encourages the House and Senate to check each other. One, which is often underappreciated, is that the House and Senate have basically the same legislative powers. There's certain things that, like, the Senate can do that the House can't, for example. But you look at countries like Germany that have bicameralism, one chamber can't introduce legislation or it can't do appropriations bills. We don't have that issue. So because the House and Senate have roughly equal powers, they can check each other pretty effectively. But they do differ. They differ, for example, in their representational base. So the Senate represents states, House represents districts. So if states and districts disagree, they have an incentive to check what the other chamber is doing. The Senate is also smaller, and members there serve for longer terms, for 6 years instead of 2 in the House. That's intentional. The founders wanted the Senate to be more deliberative. But of course, if you've got more deliberation, then maybe you come to different conclusions about policy and may say, well, we disagree with the House and we want to check what it's doing. And then finally, and we can talk more about this, the way that the House and Senate operate internally, particularly the Senate's filibuster rule, creates a very different political dynamic and creates different incentives. So in the Senate, the minority, just 40 members, can effectively block any bill that they want. So in the House, you have to think about what would pass the Senate with a supermajority, with 60 votes. And that can change your calculus, what you think you can do. And so those differences, excuse me, can encourage each chamber to kind of think of what they want to do that's different than the other chamber and possibly check what they're doing. And with that, I will conclude.
Well, thank you. And that was a great overview. And I like you, when I think of checks and balances, I have always thought about just the branches checking each other. And I think it's a fascinating concept to think about the fact that the House and Senate have checks and balances within the congressional legislative branch. So, Janine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. First, I'll explain the sunglasses, which look a little weird. So, I have on sunglasses because I'm having terrible eye problems today, terrible sensitivity with my eyes, and allergies and weird things happening with my eyes. So I have on sunglasses today, which I've never done, but it's a first. What have we done? 200 of these things? 100? I mean, what? So anyway, Dr. Green, thank you. That was very informative, laid out really, really well. So I want to, for the students that are listening, I think it's really cool. I'm thrilled we're doing this study about the checks and balances and how important they are, because these checks and balances protect our Bill of Rights. And without these checks and balances, we could fall off into anarchy or tyranny or whatever it might be, and we wouldn't have our rights. So everybody focuses on the rights, but we don't often focus on the checks and balances. So I'm thrilled we're doing this. Why don't we walk through some of those checks, more checks? I love that we could get off on the filibuster, but that's kind of a sidebar. That wasn't constitutional. Not to get off on this for extended period of time, but it is pretty wild that a minority can block a majority bill in the Senate with a filibuster. I know it's very controversial. It almost doesn't seem in line with our founders, really. I hate to be an anti-filibuster person because I know it's very popular with a lot of people, but if you have a majority and they've been elected and it's 60 people, why does the minority get to block it? When did the filibuster start? It wasn't in the Constitution.
Right. That's a great question. So the filibuster started really almost by accident. So, in a legislative chamber, you usually have some procedure that allows you to stop debate. So in the House, you have what's called the previous question motion. So after people have talked, someone can offer a motion to move the previous question, and then a majority votes, and if it passes, debate's over. Somewhere in the early to mid 19th century, the Senate, in rewriting its rules, forgot to include this motion. And at some point, some senators said, hey, this means that there's no way to stop debate. And so with that, you had the filibuster. Now, the rules for the filibuster have changed over time, but I think for purposes of understanding Congress today, what's really important is that around the 1990s, the use of the filibuster went from being something that you just didn't do unless something really mattered to you as a senator to something you just did automatically. And so what we have now is what's often called the 60 vote Senate, where pretty much everything needs 60 votes to pass. That was certainly not the intention of the founding fathers. It is not in the Constitution, as you mentioned. And it shows how self-restraint is really important when you have a gap in the rules like that. Right now, we just don't have that self-restraint. And so as a result, it's very easy to block things in the Senate.
But how does it work? I mean, this is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, right? As the actress, he just talks forever. So, is there a limited time upon which the majority in the House can vote on something, and if you talk through that, then the bill is dead? I mean, is there ever a way to get around the filibuster? I'm still a little bit confused.
Sure. So a filibuster means literally that you go to the floor and you talk and you don't stop. Uh, and as long as you keep going, no one can stop you. Now, we don't see that really. We almost never see that on the Senate floor. And that's for a couple of reasons. One of them is that the Senate has a rule, which they adopted in the early 20th century and then modified in the 1970s, called the cloture rule, which basically does allow for a vote to end a debate. But it's not a majority, it's a supermajority. So you have to have 60 votes to end debate. Whereas in a normal chamber or in the House of Representatives, for example, it's a majority plus one. So if someone starts talking, you get 60 votes, you can tell them to stop. But the other thing, the reason why you don't see filibusters is because senators don't really want to do them. So they just threaten them. So as a result, senator gets up and says, I don't like this bill. Every other senator says, oh no, they might filibuster. Well, let's just have a cloture vote. Oh, the cloture vote didn't pass. We didn't get 60 votes. I guess that person would keep talking, but we'll just have an agreement that we'll just put that bill aside, put that amendment aside, and just move on to something else. So one reform that people have suggested is to make them talk. Like if you're going to threaten to filibuster, let's make you do it. I'm not sure that would work though, because senators like to talk. There's a lot of senators who might want to join them in talking, and so probably if you really want to change things, you'd have to change the rules, to make it so that it's much harder to even threaten to filibuster. And in fact, the Senate has been doing this. It's more and more often it's changed its rules so that there's fewer things you can even threaten to filibuster.
Yeah, and I want to get off of this. We've talked about, the filibuster before, but it's still somehow always confusing. But I mean, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, if no one's ever seen the movie, it was, Jimmy Stewart. He talks forever. But I don't think I'm totally understanding, forgive me, right? Like the concept. So they're going to vote on something. The minority comes in and says, we're going to talk forever. But when they've exhausted themselves and they have finished talking, why can't there still go ahead and be a vote? I don't understand how that impedes the vote forever.
Right. You're right. So once they're tired talking, then they move to a vote. But the problem is, so in the Mr. Smith model, you have one senator who is brave enough to try to stop this bill. And so he talks and talks and talks, and he goes and goes. And other senators get tired, and his talking brings attention to the issue. voters start contacting their senators saying, you've got to, go with Mr. Smith, and he ends up winning. That's kind of the model of a filibuster. You use it very seldom. One senator does it. People are persuaded. Things change. But what happens now is it isn't one senator who threatens. It's a group of senators. It's the entire minority party that threatens. So if you have not one senator, but 47 senators who are all willing to participate in a filibuster, then one talks for 24 hours, then he takes a break and another one gets up. She talks for 24 hours, then another comes up. So the threat is real because it's now partisan. It's the minority party that threatens them. And senators just don't want to listen to, people talking for weeks on end. So just the threat is enough for senators to say, fine, we accept that you'll probably do this, even if you won't. And so we're not even going to have you talk. But again, to your point, if senators said, no, we're going to make you do it, then we would see if that happens. Maybe you're right. Maybe a senator would get up, talk for a few hours, get tired. No one else would talk. They'd say, this is a real waste of our time. And then we would actually have a vote. But we just don't see that because the threat of a filibuster is enough to scare senators into not, to basically saying, fine, the bill or amendment's dead, we'll move on.
But logically, there can still be a vote on that bill where they have the majority after the filibuster, even if it takes 3 months, and they can still vote on their bill. So it's not really blocking the bill, it's just making it inconvenient. Did I sum that correctly?
Right. But the key is that cloture motion. So what happens is that a senator threatens, they say, I don't like this, I'm going to talk forever. And then what happens is the majority party, rather than making them talk and seeing if they can outlast them, they then say, fine, we'll assume you're about to filibuster, so we're going to issue a cloture motion, or we're going to have a cloture vote, which is basically ending a filibuster. Even though the filibuster hasn't started, just the threat of one, the other party says, fine, we're going to go ahead and have a cloture vote. And a cloture vote requires 60 votes. So in some ways, it's a little bit like kabuki theater, right? We're not actually seeing the filibuster. We're seeing someone saying, I'm going to talk forever. Someone else saying, all right, well, that requires 60 votes to stop. So we'll just go ahead and have that vote. That vote fails.
Okay. So they could have the cloture vote,
up.
which closes it. So
right.
The cloture vote closes it essentially and says,
it ends debate. That's right.
60 votes, you're out. You can't filibuster. Really interesting. I don't know. Seems silly to me. I think in the mid 19th century, they should have put it in there that you can speak for a certain amount of time and then you have to stop speaking. I don't know. I know a lot of people love it, but it seems silly to me. Okay. So I didn't mean to devote all my time on that. So I'm going to take 2 more quick minutes and maybe we can cut into the end with questions here just a little bit. I want to just talk about a few more checks and balances, not for long, Jewel and, and Wyatt, but it seems to me these checks and balances, I hope my comrades, our compatriots here, or fellow hosts, whatever you want the word to be, we continue to focus on these checks and balances. Obviously, the bill, has to go back and forth and be checked. The House gets theirs and the Senate gets theirs, and then they have to merge it. That's really fascinating as well. But wouldn't you say Article 1, Section 8 is a bit of a check on the legislative branch? These are your specific enumerated powers, and it's on these things upon which you may govern and create laws, and that's it. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, sure. I mean, Article 1, Section 8 is really interesting because it lays out a number of really big powers that Congress has. And there are some of them are pretty vague, right? The necessary and proper clause. So Congress can kind of like find a way to say what we're doing is necessary and proper, even if it's not what the founders intended. But they are limited, right? So you have the 10th Amendment. Everything that's not given to the national government goes to the states or the people. So there are limits there. But I hear, one way to think about this is, even though those are limited, it's a limited list of powers. They are still pretty big powers, and the founders may have been concerned that a unicameral legislature, so just one chamber with all those powers, would be too powerful. And so they create 2 chambers, a House and a Senate, that share the power to appropriate, to levy taxes, to declare war, etc. So they have to work together if they're going to exercise these really big powers that they've been given in Article 1, Section 8.
And they are really big powers, but they were still enumerated. right? Like
That's
this
right.
is what you can deal with in the federal government, and the rest is left to the states. And it seems to me, even though you can slip and slide around it a little bit, it still was a check. Do you
Yes.
think, Article 1, Section 8 was a check?
It
I mean,
is.
that was the big argument in the Federalist Papers. Why do we need the Bill of Rights? We gave you very specific powers, and it's only this that you can deal with. We didn't say you could deal with the right to free speech. We didn't say, we said these are the powers upon. Isn't that it? So I just think that's kind of a cool check. Not that it's abided by, but I mean, it's a cool check. Yeah.
Well,
Am I
right.
wrong
And
there?
so, right. And some of the founders thought the 10th Amendment was unnecessary for the reason you just gave. But the 10th Amendment has come to be very important for those who believe that over time, the national government has found ways to sort of bend
Get
and
around it.
stretch Article 1, Section 8 and do things that were not the intention of the founding fathers.
Right, 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 right. Yeah. Well, I love the Ninth and Tenth Amendment. I love federalism, period. That you know, but there's just specific things that we're supposed to do in the federal government. Okay, I'm so glad we're doing this. Thank you. That was a really interesting discussion. For all those out there, I hope you were as confused about the filibuster as I was. I always have been. I think I have clarity on it now, though. Finally, Dr. Green, we've been discussing this for hundreds of episodes. You did it for me. All right, I'm passing. Thank you so much.
Hello, this is Joel Gilbert with Constituting America. That was great, Janine, listening to that as well, because I've been confused about the filibuster despite our shows on it too. I needed a little refresher. With, as far as the checks and balances go, within the legislative branch here, which is pretty interesting, can you tell me, are there we have some examples of how a unicameral house would have been different, and then is there any examples of like a tri or quad cameral house? Is that ever a thing?
That was a great question. So I'll take the second one first. I can't think of an example of a tricameral or a quadcameral legislature. I never thought of it before. There could be some out there, but I have to say that given how challenging it can be to legislate in a bicameral legislature, I can only imagine how complicated it would be in a tricameral legislature. Now, in terms of what our Congress would be like if it were unicameral, I think we have models of unicameral legislatures in other countries. We also have one here in the U.S. There's one state that has a unicameral legislature, that's Nebraska, that has a Senate, and they seem to be doing fine. They seem to be successful, and I don't know there's concerns about a lack of that their legislative branch is too powerful. Um, but there's other countries that like Sweden that have unicameral legislatures. Um, you tend to see them, and so if you look to those as models of how the problem is using those as a model for the U.S. because they're not really these aren't really presidential systems. They're often parliamentary systems, and so people are voting in one batch for one party, and then there are multiple parties. They're building coalitions. They're choosing the executive branch. We just don't have a system like that. Um, but I have thought from time to time, what would it be like if we only had the House or only had the Senate? And the problem here, I think, is there are weaknesses in both. There are flaws in each of them. Now, maybe those flaws would go away if the legislature knew they had to fix them because they're the only game in town. But I think about, for example, and this is sort of my perspective, one weakness of the House is because the members only serve 2-year terms. They have a very short time frame, which they're thinking about things, and they're often very, very responsive to not just the public, which was the intention of the founding fathers, but also to the president, which I am not sure was the intention of the founding fathers. And so the House alone, I don't think would be a very strong check against the executive branch. The Senate, I think senators tend to think more of themselves, excuse me, as sort of sometimes as mini presidents. They're more willing to check the executive branch, even of the same party. They serve longer terms. They are more deliberative. But because every state elects the same number of senators, you have a problem of malapportionment, which means that every state gets the same number of representatives no matter how many people are there. So in effect, if you are a resident of California, your vote, the weight of you as a person, as a voter in the Senate is far smaller than if you are, say, a resident of Wyoming. And that can lead to some weird biases where small states end up having way more influence than they would if we were thinking about just majority rule. So, can't go back in time, rewind the clock, and know what it would be like with just one chamber, other than the Articles of Confederation, which had its own issues. Um, but I guess, maybe I'm a little biased because I study American politics. I like our system of government, but I do feel that that bicameralism has a lot of advantages, not just in checking, in terms of checks between one chamber and another, but also the quality of policy and the willingness and ability to serve as a check on other branches. So, I feel like a unicameral legislature probably was not going to be as effective as the things that it does, that the U.S. Congress does. With one
Yeah,
exception, I'll just say this: unicameral would act faster, so there'd be we'd have a lot more legislation produced than we do with the bicameral legislature. That could be good, or it could be bad.
yeah. Do you think that well, first a quick aside, I do think it's funny when we talk about Washington working, and we will complain about not getting things done, or we want things to work, or we want there not to be, so much debate or something. But our founders seem to create a system which rewarded that quite a bit. So I think they wanted them to. We've had some guests mention on the show too that part of the cumbersome mechanisms seem to be part of refining the legislation itself on purpose. Um, but to my next question, uh, so do you think that the popular election of senators changed the check and balance and relationship between the Senate and the House at all for the way that it was designed constitutionally?
Yeah, I think it probably did. Before the adoption of the direct election of senators in the 1910s, um, senators, in my view, thought of themselves much more as representative of their state government. And state governments have a different set of preferences. They also have a different set of, what they think the proper roles of states vis-a-vis the national government. Um, and when senators were elected directly, I don't think it at first changed their self-perception as um, representatives of their state and an important check on the other branches of government, and that includes the House. Um, but when you're elected by voters, just like House members are, then the differences between House members' sort of viewpoint, preferences, policy ideas, and the senators, I think, got closer, especially for smaller states. So if you're a senator from California, for example, um, you're going to be thinking about things differently than any House member. You just are. You've got 25, 30 million people that you're representing. Um, you're going to be thinking about things differently. Whereas a House member is more likely to be a little more parochial. So there is still going to be a difference there. But if you are, say, a senator in Maine or Wyoming or Nebraska, there's not much of a difference, if any, between what the House members' view is of policy and the senators, because it's almost, it either is the state, the district is the state, or it's close to it. And so I would expect to see less conflict. I'd expect to see more continuity of perspective. I don't think that it changed the entire chamber at all, but I can see how if you're a senator from a small population state, your views are not going to be all that different than your House counterpart. And in fact, if you are a House member from some of these states, it's actually better for you because if you're, say, the House member of Wyoming, you're the only representative of the entire state. Whereas in the Senate, there are two senators in Wyoming. So they have to work together and might have disagreements or might even be the opposite party. So
That's a
it's sort of
funny
like being,
juxtaposition.
sorry?
I said that's a pretty funny juxtaposition in that state like that.
Right. Like Representative Hageman from Wyoming is like, she's like a senator. She's like a senator on her own, you know? She's in the House, so she's one of 435, but she is the House representative for the entire state.
Yeah, the uh, I've when we started this podcast, when I started getting more into learning about the Constitution by entering the contest, and I had entered a VFW contest, and in my civics lessons when we learned about some of the major changes in our government, it was almost hard to imagine some things like, not having popular election of senators. But those are pretty huge things we get to talk to great guests like you about. So thank you. And I'll pass on to Wyatt.
Well, thank you, Jewel. Yes, this is Wyatt Hensley here, and what a great podcast as usual. Thank you, Dr. Green, for being here and discussing this important topic. So my first question, during your opening remarks, you had mentioned something about legislative despotism. I'm just curious, could you expand on that? Maybe go in more depth about what that exactly means and why the founders were so afraid of it?
Sure. Well, of course, despotism in a general sense applies to any branch of government or any form of government where you have someone who is, or some institution that's unaccountable to voters, that acts in ways that are arbitrary, ignores the rule of law, may, pass legislation or otherwise act in ways that take on certain groups or individuals, with prejudice or animus. Um, and those kinds of things could apply or describe any of our three branches of government. I mean, you can have judicial despotism, you can have judges who just act arbitrarily, throwing people in prison, things like that, convicting people without cause. You can have executive despotism, but you can have legislative despotism as well. So I think in the abstract for the founders, it was less which institution than the fact that any institution with power can act in a despotic way. Now, having said that, with legislative despotism, they were probably thinking of a number of examples. They were probably thinking about some of the acts of parliament directed against the colonies. They were also thinking about some examples at the state level, where there were state legislatures that had, they felt, too much power and had passed legislation that was harmful to individuals, did some of the things that I had just mentioned. And so they had both the abstract theoretical reasons for thinking about legislative despotism and then some examples of legislatures that act this way. And, I think anyone could probably, if you look at a book on the history of Congress, could probably find at least one example of something Congress did that they thought was a really bad law. It was short-sighted, it hurt people, it damaged the country in some way, and that's with checks and balances. So imagine if we didn't have two chambers, if we didn't have a president that could veto legislation, if the courts didn't have judicial review, you could see many more examples of that kind of thing. So nothing is foolproof or prevents any institution from acting in a despotic way. The point is to have bicameralism so that you have two chambers checking each other, which reduces the likelihood of legislative despotism.
Very interesting, and I really do like your point saying that, yeah, no system is perfect, but if we can try to ensure a decrease in likelihood of these despotic or, not great things that they do, it's very interesting. My next question, so how do the leaders of each chamber, how can they, or how do they impact the system of checks and balances? What powers do they have to act as a check?
It's a great question. So each chamber has a constitutional leader, and then they have basically a party leader, if you will. So the House of Representatives, it's the Speaker of the House. In the Senate, technically, it's the Vice President. Now, the Senate realized pretty quickly that wasn't really a good idea because they didn't get to choose the Vice President. The Vice President might be of the opposite party of the majority. So they created the position of Majority Leader. And that is the person sort of tasked with the power to help set the agenda, to whip for votes, etc. In the House, the Speaker was chosen by the House, so there was no need to create a new position. But over time, that position became more partisan. And so the rough equivalent we have today is the Senate Majority Leader and the House Speaker. And of course, the minority party in each chamber has its leadership as well. They are chosen by in the House, the Speaker is chosen by the whole chamber, in the Senate by the majority party. So what their constituency wants really matters. Sometimes the constituency does not care about the other chamber. They may not want checks on the other chamber. They may want cooperation with the other chamber, in which case a leader might be chosen who is not willing to stand up for their chamber vis-a-vis the other chamber. Other times that's different. That members of the legislature say, we do want somebody who's going to stand up against that other chamber, and we'll pick someone that way. And sometimes they pick someone for one reason and it becomes something else. So maybe they think, yeah, we're in the House, we have a speaker who cooperate with the Senate. Then the Senate starts misbehaving, and you tell the speaker, you know what, you need to stand up for our chamber here. So leaders do play an important part in this. It just varies by the leader and it depends on what the members of the legislature want. I will say, and we can talk more about this, that even when you have the same party in the majority in the House and Senate, and they have leaders that get along well and want to work together, they are different chambers. They have different institutional incentives. And sometimes these differences come out even when you'd think they'd get along. There was an old saying in the House of Representatives where one member of the majority told another member of the majority, just remember this, the other party is the opposition. The other chamber is the enemy. So that kind of ethos, I think, is always there to a degree, no matter how much cooperation members claim they want to have or leaders say they want. There's still some rivalries there.
Yeah, very interesting. I didn't, even think about that, how, whether they want cooperation or they want to challenge the other chamber really and check on it can impact who does become leader of each chamber. That's very interesting. And that kind of goes into my next question too. How has the increase in political polarization of political parties impacted the checks and balances found within Congress? You briefly talked about the filibuster and how the minority party might use that to their advantage, but what are some other examples?
Sure, it's a great question, Wyatt. So I think polarization has had an effect in a number of different ways. So on the one hand, it has made it harder to legislate because it's harder to get the other party to cooperate with the majority party for good reasons or bad. And then you couple that with very small majorities, as we see right now in the House and Senate, that every vote matters because you can only really get the votes of your party on big things. So that makes it hard just to pass a bill in one chamber. And then you have the other chamber, and you've got to get the same bill passed in that chamber. So it really almost geometrically increases the difficulty of legislating. And that fact of bicameralism there is important. On the other hand, though, the same dynamic that makes it harder to legislate also encourages team play and encourages members to work together at the same party. And conceivably, that can cross from one chamber to the other. So you may have, Republican majority in the House, Republican majority in the Senate. Yes, the other party's the opposition, the other chamber's the enemy. But man, we're all Republicans, right? We've got to try to get this thing passed, whatever it is. And so that might help kind of bridge the gap between the two chambers, but then, of course, reduce the willingness of one chamber to check the other chamber. I think it still varies by issue. I can think of examples in our polarized climate where majority parties in the House and Senate worked really well together. I can think of ones in our climate where they really didn't work well together. But that desire to get things done as a party, it can discourage one chamber from pushing too hard against the other chamber.
And and you're talking about the cooperation between the chambers. Which type of committee is it where both members of the Senate and both members of the House can work together? Is it a conference committee?
Right. So there's I think you're thinking of conference committees. There are certain committees that are set up called joint committees that deal with certain issues like I think it's Joint Committee on Aging is one, I think.
Mm.
But in terms of working out differences, there's a formal process, which is House has its version of a bill, Senate has its version. They get together in a conference committee, and then they meet and they hash out the differences. This is one very important development in recent decades, which is the disappearance of conference committees. Conference committees are almost extinct now. What's happening is informal conversations behind the scenes because conference committees take time and there's back and forth between the members of each chamber, and then the minority party gets to have members on the conference committee too. So even though that was an informal kind of secret process, it was at least a process. But what we're seeing now is a lot more behind the scenes conversations. And then suddenly, boom, we just have this magic bill that everyone agreed on somewhere, somehow. And that's how differences increasingly are worked out between the two chambers.
Wow, very, very fascinating. A whole lot of information that I just learned, and I will pass it back on to Kathy. Thank you so much, Dr. Green.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Well, thank you, Wyatt and Jewel and Janine and Dr. Green. Great discussion so far. And before we go to the audience questions, we want to recognize teachers and students who are watching today. And even though it's summer, we still have a few teachers with students tuning in. We have Teresa Kukla with 46 students from Tabernacle School watching. And we have Samantha Reeves with 20 students from Crowley County Junior Senior High School watching. So welcome to our teachers with students watching. And if you are a teacher or a student watching, drop us a note in the Q&A and we'll try to give you a shout out before the end of the show. I also saw Kenyon Wanaus, who I know is a homeschool student who's watching. So welcome, Kenyon. We're glad to see you in the audience as well. We also want to thank our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats on Thursdays now at 6 p.m. We're now on Thursdays at 6 p.m. on KKVV 1060 AM in Las Vegas. So thank you, Las Vegas, for listening. So, Dr. Green, first we're going to start with Eric Braverman, who asks, would checks and balances be easier if the Senate and House had better matching committees, which had confluence with the president's cabinet? Would it be, in other words, if the committees matched up more with the president's cabinet, and if the committees matched each other? I mean, I think the committees may be a little bit different in the House and in the Senate as far as jurisdiction goes. Is that true?
I mean, there is some difference. I don't think there's excuse me. I don't think there's enough difference to really hinder cooperation across the two chambers. So for example, the House has a committee that deals with taxes and trade, ways and means. The Senate has a committee called the Finance Committee, but it does the same thing. It's a different name. And I don't think if they corresponded with the cabinet, with cabinet positions, it would necessarily change things that much. So to my view, it's not really committees that are the key to the extent to which the House and Senate check each other. I think there's other factors that matter more, in my view, than committee jurisdiction.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And then Julianne Smith asks, what is the most famous filibuster? What was the issue and was it successful for what the senators wanted?
Well, there's several famous filibusters. The first one that comes to mind, which until recently had the record, was the record for the longest filibuster, was Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who was filibustering a civil rights bill in 1964. And he spoke for just about 24 hours. It did not achieve, if his goal was to kill the bill, it didn't work. When he was done, he sat down and the Senate proceeded to consider the legislation and pass it. But it did show us something that's important about filibusters, which is another criticism of them, which is they can be used for, frankly, grandstanding opportunities. So when Senator Thurmond decided to filibuster this civil rights bill, other Southern senators who didn't like the bill had already decided it was going to pass. And they told Senator Thurmond, there's no need to block this, it's going to happen. But he wanted to show his constituents who oppose civil rights that he was still on their side. So one of the problems, getting back to my point earlier about, well, let's let everyone just talk and talk in a filibuster until they get tired. In this day and age, some senators actually are encouraged to talk because they get more attention. They get more campaign finance donations. They get more votes. May help them if they run for president. And that doesn't necessarily achieve a legislative goal. So not all filibusters have been that way, and certainly many of them are for principled reasons. But in that is an example of one that really it's hard to pinpoint any kind of policy outcome that benefited so much as the senator doing it, getting a lot of attention for it.
Well, thank you. And Joseph Polinsky asks, where did the idea of a 6-year term for senators come from? And do you agree with the terms being that long?
So this was something that at the Constitutional Convention was debated about length of term. And the idea of 6 years was first of all, you wanted it to be longer than the House. That the House really should be more immediately responsive to the will of the public. But 6 years gives senators more time to be reflective, to deliberate legislation, and not worry about if they do one thing wrong, they'll lose their seat. I don't think, to my view, 6 years is fine. In fact, if anything, I think the issue is with the House's 2-year terms, which are so short that in this day and age, right, what they tell, the kind of conventional wisdom, if you're elected to the House for the first time, is your party comes to you and says, congratulations, you can take one day off. And then tomorrow you need to start raising money. And you need to start thinking about your next campaign. And so it's really not enough time in our media environment, in our campaign environment, to sit down and think seriously about legislation, get to know your colleagues, think about like your longer goals in Congress. So to me, 6 years I think is fine. Maybe the House being 4 years would be of some benefit to that chamber. But the general idea of difference in terms, I think, makes sense in that the Senate is supposed to be more deliberative. Senators are going to be thinking beyond just the next 2 years or 4 years. They're thinking even maybe after the current president leaves office, right? They're thinking beyond that. And so I think that's a big advantage that senators have.
Well, thank you. And staying focused on the Senate for a minute, I know we talked a little bit about the 17th Amendment earlier. We've had several audience members very interested in it and asking various aspects of it. And Julie Baldridge asked, do you think when senators were elected by the legislature of the state itself, that it strengthened the concept of federalism and the decentralization of power?
I think, as before, when I was talking earlier about the 17th Amendment, how it changed senators, I think it was a gradual change. I do think that senators' identity has shifted because of the 17th Amendment. Before, when they were elected by their legislature, there were I think at least two things that mattered. Number one, they were elected by the legislature. And the legislature itself is elected by the state. So they're really, they're there to represent the state government. Whereas now, they're not. They don't have to think about the state government. They don't have to think about the governor. They do, but they don't have to think about the governor or the state legislature at all. They just have to think about the voters. So in that respect, I think it weakens the power of state governments. And the second thing is that sometimes these senators themselves came from state legislatures. Now, that's still true today, but you're more likely to get elected to the Senate if you're already a member of the state legislature that makes that decision. Whereas now, you don't have to. You could just say, I'm just really popular in my state. I'm an astronaut, I'm a football coach, whatever. I have no prior legislative experience. I know nothing about how state politics works, but now I'm in the US Senate. And I think that's a weakness. I think that does make the Senate less knowledgeable about how their states operate. They're less knowledgeable about state politics. And yeah, I think in a way that does weaken federalism. And it does weaken the ties that senators had to their states as, as semi-sovereign political entities.
Thank you for that. And when I was getting ready for the show, I think you and I talked about this a little bit before we started today, this afternoon. Could you? I had noticed that the House and the Senate have to approve each other adjourning. Is it adjourning or what was it? Adjourning for more than 3 days. And that's actually in the US Constitution. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. So, for both chambers to adjourn, they have to each agree that they would be able to do that. Now, what happens in a normal meeting of Congress is uh, the House or Senate might go into recess, meaning they're taking a break, but they'll be back. But if they want to actually adjourn, and especially adjourn sine die, which means they are done for the year for that Congress, they can't do it unless the other chamber for more than 3 days, unless the other chamber agrees. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense because imagine that the House decides we don't really have anything to do. The Senate wants to do a bunch of things we don't like. Let's just adjourn. Let's just go home. And once they leave, the Senate can't operate because you need both the House and Senate to agree on a bill in order for it to potentially become law. So it requires, it sort of forces cooperation. It's sort of like a kind of forced marriage contract. Okay. We're in this together. You can't just leave. Okay. You can take a 3-day vacation, but you got to come back again. Now, if you both agree that you're done, that's fine. But you can't have one chamber agree to do it. You have to work together.
Great. Thank you so much. And we've got a couple of audience comments I wanted to get to. Mary says, back to the House terms being 2 years, agree 2 years is not nearly enough time. And Velma Vela from the Valley View ISD, located in Far, Texas, is just saying hello. She's a librarian. And we've actually spoken to Miss Vela's school, I think at Valley View. Maybe it was Valley View Elementary. I in Hidalgo, Texas. I know we were there. So Velma, thank you for tuning in, and Mary, thank you for your comment. And I think we'll close with Patrick Jacobs' question. Patrick asks, even though all three branches are supposed to be co-equal, do you feel that the framers saw more importance in the legislative branch and meant for it to have more power and authority over the other two since it was created first under Article 1?
Yes. Okay, so I'll just full disclosure, I do have bias. I'm a big I'm a big Article 1 fan. I'm a big I'm a big Congress fan. Yeah, I don't think it was an accident that the first article is the legislative branch, and I don't think it's an accident that it's the longest of the first three articles of the Constitution. Congress believed the legislative branch should be strong. They believe that any representative democracy has to have a strong legislature because it is the only it's the only branch that truly represents the country and the diversity of interests and diversity of groups in a country of the three. Now, as Janine mentioned earlier, it wasn't unlimited power, and the theme of our conversation today has been the dangers of legislative tyranny. And so, for example, you have a bicameral legislature. But really, in my view, the founders thought Congress was an essential branch, if not the most important branch in our constitutional system, and that it was imperative that it have the big powers that it's been given in Article 1, Section 8, in order to protect and maintain our democracy.
Well, thank you. And that's a great way to close out the show today. We want to thank you so much for being with us. And Wyatt and Jewel and Janine and Jorn, thank you all for your great questions on the panel today. We want to invite our audience to come back next week when we're going to take a step back and talk about how all these checks and balances emerged. Our episode next week is Balancing Act, the founder's big idea, the origins of checks and balances. So we're going to go back to the beginning and how all these checks and balances came about. And then as we work through our upcoming episodes, we're going to be talking about other checks and balances as we did today with the checks and balances in Congress. So thank you all for being with us. And Dr. Green, it was such an honor having you. And thank you for your great work at Catholic University of America.
Thank you. And thanks for the great work that you're all doing.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.